Rome has seen its share of ruthless conquerors and shrewd statesmen, but none quite like Emperor Elagabalus. Crowned as a teenager, he turned the empire's highest throne into a stage for bizarre rituals, scandalous pleasures, and shocking defiance of tradition. To some, he was a reckless youth, intoxicated by power. To others, a dangerous figure who blurred the sacred lines that held Rome together. His reign, though brief, rattled senators, soldiers, and citizens alike, leaving behind whispers of orgies, strange gods, and dangerous excess. Step inside the candlelit chambers of the Palatine, where silk-draped banquets and twisted games shock the Roman world, and discover why Elagabalus's name still lingers as one of history's most scandalous rulers. The boy emperor arrives. Rome had never seen an emperor so young or so unconventional. In March of 218 CE, a 14-year-old boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus, later known as Elagabalus, was declared emperor following the sudden assassination of Caracalla. The rise of this adolescent ruler was orchestrated by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, a politically astute and ambitious matron from Emesa in Syria. Maesa leveraged her family's connection to the Severan dynasty and claimed her grandson was the illegitimate son of Caracalla, a narrative that secured military support from Legio III Gallica, stationed near Emesa. With the backing of these troops, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor in Antioch before traveling to Rome, marking the beginning of a reign that would astonish, scandalize, and unsettle the Roman world. His ascent demonstrated the influence of familial networks in imperial succession and highlighted the fragility of Rome's political system when confronted with sudden, unexpected changes in leadership. The youth and inexperience of the new emperor immediately alarmed the Senate and citizenry. Romans were accustomed to rulers with proven military or administrative experience, often men who had spent decades serving the empire. A 14-year-old Syrian boy, with no formal training in governance or military command, represented an unprecedented disruption. His age, foreign heritage, and unfamiliar customs created tension with traditional political institutions, forcing senators who had wielded influence under Septimius Severus and Caracalla to navigate the unpredictable priorities of a teenager whose decisions were guided by whimsy, ritual, and the counsel of his maternal family. The juxtaposition of youth and power, unsettled, long-established hierarchies, and reshaped expectations of authority within the empire. Elagabalus's background intensified these concerns. Born in 203 CE in Emesa, he was the scion of a family serving as hereditary priests of the sun god Elagabal, a deity largely unknown to Romans. From childhood, he had been trained in the rituals and ceremonies of his native city, learning complex chants, sacrifices, and observances that were foreign to Roman eyes. Bringing this religious authority to the capital, he unsettled traditionalists who feared that civic and religious norms might be undermined. By the time he arrived in Rome later in 218 CE, the city faced a ruler whose worldview sharply diverged from the Stoic and martial ideals that had long defined the Principate, signaling potential cultural, political, and religious upheaval. The initial months of his reign focused on consolidating power. Julia Maesa and her daughter, Julia Soaemius, assumed prominent roles, managing the young emperor's public image, advising on political decisions, and acting as intermediaries between him and the Senate. Their influence was crucial in maintaining the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, whose support was essential for the new emperor. Caracalla's prior campaigns had left fragile political alliances, and Rome's court quickly became a center of intrigue as officials, senators, and military officers sought favor, protection, or survival under a ruler whose judgment remained uncertain. Court life became an unpredictable theater, in which protocol and hierarchy were often subordinated to the whims of the adolescent emperor and the strategies of his maternal family. Even during these early months, Elagabalus signaled cultural and religious shifts that would define his reign. While he maintained the outward forms of traditional Roman ceremonies, he continued private practices tied to his Syrian heritage. Emesa's elaborate and exotic rituals gradually entered the imperial palace, foreshadowing a blending of religion and authority that would shock the Roman elite. The contrast between Roman expectations and the emperor's upbringing created a climate of curiosity, suspicion, and growing tension, laying the foundation for the extraordinary spectacles, controversies, and scandals to come. Despite the upheaval, the boy emperor's rule was initially tolerated, largely due to Julia Maesa's political skill and military influence. Yet every public appearance underscored his youth, foreignness, and divergence from Roman norms. Contemporary accounts, and later historians, suggest his behavior was often erratic and provocative, though it remained largely overshadowed by the authority of his maternal advisors. By the end of 218 CE, Elagabalus had secured the throne, but Rome had been introduced to a ruler whose age, origin, and religious practices set him apart from all predecessors. His arrival was more than a political event. It marked the beginning of a reign that would push social, cultural, and religious boundaries and usher in an era of unprecedented extravagance, scandal, and instability in the Roman Empire. The empire had entered a period in which youth, ambition, and foreign influence would redefine expectations of power, governance, and imperial spectacle. A god among men, Elagabalus did not simply ascend the Roman throne in 218 CE. He arrived with a god at his side. From the outset, he elevated the Syrian sun deity Elagabal, also called Sol Invictus, above Jupiter and all other traditional Roman gods, introducing religious practices that were foreign, elaborate, and often shocking to Rome's established order. To house his deity, Elagabalus commissioned the Elagabalium, a lavish temple on the Palatine hill, adorned with imported marbles, gilded statues, and intricate mosaics depicting solar imagery. The emperor demanded that senators, priests, and citizens participate in rituals, processions, and sacrifices associated with the cult, forcing Rome to confront a theological hierarchy that prioritized a foreign god over centuries of Roman tradition. These ceremonies were not occasional events. They became fixtures of public and political life, ensuring the presence of Elagabal's worship in the daily consciousness of the city. The emperor's devotion to Elagabal was deeply rooted in his upbringing. Born in 203 CE in Emesa, he was heir to a family of hereditary priests who had long overseen the worship of the sun god. From childhood, he performed complex rituals, managed sacred objects, and carried the religious authority of his lineage. When transplanted to Rome, these practices took on political significance. By asserting the supremacy of Elagabal, Elagabalus effectively subordinated Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and other deities, central to Roman civic and religious life, signaling a cultural and political challenge to the traditional elite. His upbringing also included the study of Syrian and Phoenician ceremonial music, attire, and symbolic gestures, which were integrated into the rituals in ways that astonished traditional Roman observers. Resistance was immediate. The Pontifical College of Priests and the traditional Roman religious hierarchy viewed the elevation of Elagabal as a direct challenge to their authority, while senators feared the erosion of established power structures. Ordinary citizens struggled to reconcile their familiar rituals with the exotic ceremonies now central to imperial worship. Yet the emperor pressed forward with processions, sacrifices, and grand spectacles, ensuring that participation in Elagabalian rituals became both a civic expectation and a political necessity. Refusal or hesitation could be interpreted as impiety or disloyalty to the emperor himself, and early reports suggest that some members of the elite complied reluctantly, attending ceremonies to avoid suspicion. The Elagabalium became a stage for both devotion and spectacle. During ceremonies, the sacred stone from Emesa, believed to house the essence of the god, was carried through the temple by priests and accompanied by elaborate processions. Exotic animals were displayed, priests performed ritual dances, and the emperor himself appeared in ceremonial attire, placing the god at the literal and figurative center of Roman power. Such displays created awe, but also unease. The combination of a teenage ruler and unfamiliar religious rites provoked confusion, fear, and fascination among Rome's elites and commoners alike. Reports indicate that some ceremonies lasted hours, with incense, music, and dramatic lighting enhancing the sensory experience. Elagabalus also sought to integrate Rome's political and religious figures into these ceremonies. Senators were sometimes required to participate in rituals or wear ceremonial garb. Magistrates were compelled to publicly recognize Elagabal's supremacy, and even the Vestal virgins were drawn into practices that blurred the lines between Roman piety and Syrian custom. By entangling politics with ritual, the emperor transformed religious observance into a mechanism of control, reinforcing his authority while asserting that loyalty to Elagabal was inseparable from loyalty to the throne. Some Romans adapted pragmatically, seeking favor or protection through participation. Others resisted quietly, critical of the emperor's foreign worship and what they perceived as the destabilization of civic norms. Yet by intertwining religion and politics, Elagabalus made dissent risky, and the rituals of the Elagabalium became a public measure of loyalty and influence. Participation was rewarded, refusal punished, and all of Rome was drawn into a new spiritual hierarchy that revolved around the sun god. By the end of 218 CE, the elevation of Elagabal had begun reshaping the city's religious and political landscape. Rome faced a young emperor whose devotion to a foreign deity challenged centuries of tradition, whose public ceremonies blended politics and piety, and whose insistence on inclusion forced citizens and elites alike into participation. Elagabalus had not only introduced a god to Rome, he had declared that imperial authority and religious devotion were inseparable, setting the stage for a reign that would challenge every assumption about power, faith, and the Roman state, creating tensions that would ripple through the empire for years to come. Lavish palaces and exotic decor. Rome had never witnessed imperial luxury on such a scale. From the moment Elagabalus arrived in 218 CE, both the city's elite and common citizens were struck not only by the youth of their new emperor, but by the astonishing extravagance of his surroundings. The Palatine Hill was transformed into a theater of opulence, as Elagabalus converted the imperial palace into a showcase of wealth, power, and foreign taste. Silk draperies, imported from the east, lined the halls. Gold and silver furnishings reflected candlelight across polished marble floors, and intricate mosaics brought from Syria and North Africa depicted religious, mythological, and solar imagery. Every element of decor reinforced the emperor's identity as a ruler unbound by traditional Roman restraint, signaling a court that existed as much for spectacle and impression as for governance. Elagabalus's obsession with imported luxury extended to every corner of the palace. Bronze and gilded furniture, cushions stuffed with exotic feathers, and carpets woven from rare materials created a visual and tactile experience unfamiliar to Roman eyes. Chambers were perfumed with incense brought from Arabia, and aromatic oils shipped across the Mediterranean filled rooms with scents previously reserved for temples or the homes of Rome's wealthiest patricians. Exotic animals, including peacocks, monkeys, and even lions, were kept in courtyards, aviaries, or interior enclosures, adding unpredictability and theatricality to the environment. Guests navigating these spaces encountered a world that merged domestic comfort, ceremonial display, and subtle intimidation. The emperor's mastery of luxury mirrored his command over power, leaving a lasting impression on visiting dignitaries, senators, and officials. Each room was designed with both aesthetic and social function in mind. The triclinium, or formal dining hall, served as the centerpiece for imperial entertainments. Decorated with gilt columns, intricate friezes, and seating arrangements that encouraged observation and reinforced social hierarchy, guests were constantly reminded of Elagabalus's connection to the sun god through imagery, sacred objects, and ritual artifacts prominently displayed throughout the palace. Private chambers, gardens, and courtyards combined exotic flora with imported stones, fountains, and statuary to create spaces that felt deliberately foreign, sensual, and disorienting. Every corner of the palace reinforced that Elagabalus's court operated under a logic distinct from traditional Roman norms, emphasizing spectacle over simplicity or restraint, and public display over private discretion. The emperor's personal quarters reflected a taste for theatricality and constant reinvention. Furnishings, draperies, and decorative arrangements were frequently shifted to suit ceremonies, banquets, or seasonal celebrations. Floors and walls were adorned with mosaics depicting Syrian rituals or celestial motifs, while ceilings were painted with stars, suns, and intricate patterns. Lamps infused with rare oils illuminated rooms in ways designed to impress, disorient, or overwhelm visitors. Contemporary accounts suggest that senators and visiting dignitaries were often unsettled by the combination of unfamiliar decor and exotic animals, a deliberate assertion of imperial dominance through both visual and sensory experiences. Elagabalus imported artisans, architects, and decorators from across the empire to execute these designs. Skilled craftsmen from Greece, Syria, and Egypt worked on mosaics, woodwork, gilded statues, and intricately inlaid furniture. Even minor details, from door handles shaped like mythological creatures to geometric patterns on floors and walls, reflected a conscious blending of cultural influences and a rejection of strictly Roman aesthetic conventions. Participation in this court required navigating spaces that asserted the emperor's authority visually and socially, making loyalty a matter of both appearance and political alignment. The palace's outdoor spaces were equally extravagant. Gardens incorporated fountains, sculptures, and rare plant species requiring constant care, while courtyards hosted public ceremonies, displays of exotic animals, and theatrical spectacles. Every visitor moving through these areas was reminded of the emperor's wealth, reach, and capacity to transform ordinary environments into arenas of awe and authority. By the end of 218 CE, Elagabalus's palaces had established both the physical and symbolic framework for his reign. Through lavish decoration, imported materials, and the careful orchestration of space, he created a court that was simultaneously a stage, a political instrument, and a demonstration of absolute imperial power. The palaces were more than residences. They were tools designed to impress, intimidate, and redefine the boundaries of Roman taste, authority, and ceremonial life. The unforgettable banquets. Elagabalus did not merely dine. He transformed meals into theatrical events that astonished, shocked, and often overwhelmed Rome. From early in his reign in 218 CE, banquets became central to his courtly life, turning the act of eating into an extension of imperial spectacle and authority. Guests, including senators, foreign dignitaries, and courtiers, were summoned to elaborate halls where every detail from seating arrangements to menu selection was designed to demonstrate the emperor's wealth, taste, and capacity for extravagance. The triclinium on the Palatine hill served not just as a dining room, but as a stage upon which the power, creativity, and often the unpredictability of the young ruler were displayed, and where every meal became an occasion for display, negotiation, and subtle intimidation. The banquets themselves were staggering in scale. Tables groaned under the weight of exotic dishes, many sourced from across the empire. Spiced meats from Asia Minor, seafood from the Mediterranean, and fruits from North Africa appeared alongside delicacies imported from Arabia and India. Guests were sometimes offered pheasants, peacocks, and even ostriches served whole, adorned with precious metals or aromatic spices. Wines were poured in abundance, often mixed with honey or flavored with rare herbs, and carefully aged vintages were reserved for the most honored attendees. Elagabalus's intent was clear. He used these feasts to create sensory immersion, leaving visitors awed, intimidated, or uncomfortably dazzled, while signaling that to partake in his table was to acknowledge his absolute authority. The emperor's banquets were not just about food. They were theatrical performances in which all senses were engaged. Elaborate displays of lights, music, and movement accompanied the courses. Servants moved in choreographed sequences, presenting dishes on golden platters, while musicians performed in courtyards and halls. Perfumes filled the air, rose petals were scattered across floors, and exotic animals might wander among the guests, from tame lions to brightly colored birds. The combination of lavish food, overwhelming scents, and constant visual spectacle created an environment in which diners experienced both pleasure and disorientation. In this way, meals became instruments of imperial power, asserting dominance through controlled sensory experience and reinforcing the emperor's reputation for unpredictability. Seating arrangements and social positioning were carefully manipulated to reinforce hierarchy and influence. Senators and courtiers were sometimes placed next to favored companions or deliberately juxtaposed with rivals. Attendance was mandatory for many elites, and failure to appear could be interpreted as disrespect to the emperor. Elagabalus often observed reactions closely, using the banquets to gauge loyalty, test patience, and manipulate political alliances. In this sense, the feasts were not simply indulgence, they were active instruments of governance and control, blending luxury with subtle coercion and psychological strategy. Some banquets escalated into bizarre and shocking spectacles. Historical accounts suggest that the emperor occasionally employed mechanical devices to release birds, perfumes, or even water over guests, creating surprise or discomfort. Dishes might be served in unexpected sequences, or lavish foods mixed with unusual ingredients, reflecting the emperor's delight in unpredictability. While some visitors were amused or impressed, others were humiliated, physically overwhelmed, or emotionally unsettled, reinforcing the sense that participation in these meals was inseparable from submission to the emperor's authority and presence. Elagabalus also incorporated religious and cultural elements into the banquets. References to Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, were woven into the ceremonies, with ritual objects placed on tables or processions passing through dining halls during service. Music, dances, and even the presence of priests performing rites occasionally accompanied meals, merging culinary indulgence with religious spectacle. By entwining faith, power, and entertainment, Elagabalus's banquets became comprehensive demonstrations of imperial ideology, in which the emperor's personal devotion, taste, and control were inseparable. By the end of 218 CE, these feasts had established a defining feature of Elagabalus's court. Banquets were no longer simple occasions for sustenance. They were performances, political instruments, and statements of imperial dominance. Through meticulous planning, extravagance, and sensory excess, the young emperor turned eating into a tool for displaying wealth, managing alliances, and asserting his unprecedented authority. For Rome's elite, to dine with Elagabalus was to experience the reach of imperial power in its most immediate, tangible, and often disorienting form. The memory of these feasts, often recounted in both awe and horror, would become a lasting emblem of his reign and its excesses. Perfume, flowers, and smothering guests. Elagabalus did not limit spectacle to the food he served. He extended theatricality into the very air of his banquets. From early in his reign, in 218 CE, the emperor employed perfumes, flowers, and other olfactory delights as instruments of both pleasure and power. Lavish rose petals, sometimes imported in vast quantities from Syria or Asia Minor, were scattered across floors, ceilings, and even tables, filling the rooms with intoxicating scents. The emperor delighted in the shock these displays caused. In some instances, so many petals were released from ceiling mechanisms that guests were momentarily buried beneath a fragrant avalanche, unable to see or breathe easily, a reminder that indulgence came with the implicit requirement of submission and immediate adaptation to the overwhelming spectacle. Perfumes and oils were no less extreme. Rich essences made from amber, myrrh, and rare spices from Arabia and India permeated the halls, often mixing to create unfamiliar and overpowering aromas. Lamps were sometimes infused with scented oils, releasing waves of perfume as they burned. Historical accounts describe visitors fainting, coughing, or becoming disoriented, while others were mesmerized by the experience. The use of fragrance was not merely aesthetic. It reinforced the emperor's control over the environment, demonstrating that even the air Romans breathed in the imperial palace could be manipulated by his authority. Every inhale was a reminder of proximity to power and privilege, and of the risks of disfavor or perceived disrespect. Flowers, especially roses, played both decorative and dramatic roles. They were not limited to floor coverings. Petals were often released from hidden chambers above banquet halls, dropped upon guests during ceremonial processions, or arranged in elaborate patterns on tables and furniture. Some accounts claim that during particularly extravagant feasts, petals were so abundant that guests could be completely submerged, leaving them vulnerable to accidental injury or embarrassment. The spectacle was simultaneously beautiful, dangerous, and humiliating, emphasizing the emperor's control over both pleasure and discomfort. Attendance became a negotiation between awe and caution. Participation was expected, yet survival depended on composure, careful observation, and adherence to imperial etiquette. The combination of scents, petals, and theatrical presentation often transformed ordinary spaces into immersive experiences. Courtyards, dining halls, and even private chambers were filled with music, dancing, and ceremonial displays, all accompanied by fragrances and flowers that intensified perception. Guests were constantly reminded that they were participating in a carefully choreographed demonstration of imperial authority. The overwhelming sensory environment reflected Elagabalus's understanding of power as performance. Those who could endure the spectacle demonstrated loyalty, while those who faltered risked social embarrassment or exclusion from future favors and invitations. These techniques also intersected with ritual. Ceremonial processions connected to the cult of Elagabal frequently passed through banquets and gatherings, blending religious devotion with sensory display. Priests carrying sacred objects, attendants sprinkling scented oils, and dancers performing ritualized movements created a seamless fusion of faith, entertainment, and control. By merging religion with theatrical excess, Elagabalus made participation both a spiritual and social obligation. The emperor's personal devotion to Elagabal was made visible in every petal dropped, every fragrance released, and every carefully orchestrated spectacle. The effects on guests were profound and varied. senators, courtiers, and visiting dignitaries were simultaneously awed, disoriented, and, at times, frightened. Some historians argue that the intensity of these experiences served to destabilize traditional hierarchies, placing the emperor at the center of authority through manipulation of environment and perception. The young ruler's methods ensured that power was experienced physically and emotionally, leaving indelible impressions that would define the memory of his court. Every feast, every hall perfumed and decorated, became a testament to Elagabalus's willingness to challenge convention, reshape expectation, and redefine what it meant to hold imperial sway. By the end of 218 CE, it was clear that Elagabalus's use of perfume, flowers, and dramatic environmental effects had become a hallmark of his reign. The emperor transformed banquets into immersive performances that tested endurance, measured loyalty, and impressed upon Rome's elite the full extent of his power. These displays were not mere indulgence. They were deliberate exercises in authority, spectacle, and control, signaling that under the boy emperor, even beauty, scent, and theater could become instruments of imperial domination and unforgettable memory. Cross-dressing and role reversals. Elagabalus's disregard for social norms extended beyond architecture, banquets, and religious spectacle. He also challenged Roman conceptions of gender and public decorum. From the earliest months of his reign, in 218 CE, the young emperor embraced cross-dressing, theatrical role reversals, and gender fluidity, deliberately pushing boundaries that traditional Roman society considered inviolable. Contemporary accounts describe him appearing in public dressed in women's clothing, adorned with jewelry and makeup, and insisting that attendants, courtiers, and even senators adopt unfamiliar roles during court ceremonies. These actions were as much a display of personal expression as a calculated assertion of imperial dominance, demonstrating that under his reign, convention could be bent or broken at the whim of the emperor, and his audience's reactions were as much part of the performance as his attire. Elagabalus's fascination with cross-dressing extended to formal ceremonies and banquets. He reportedly wore elaborate tunics and gowns, sometimes styled in Syrian fashion, paired with intricate jewelry, perfumes, and even wigs. These appearances were shocking to the Roman elite, who expected masculine austerity from emperors, especially in public functions. By presenting himself in this manner, Elagabalus blurred the line between male and female, ruler and subject, performer and citizen, creating confusion and unease. Senators and courtiers were uncertain whether to respond with deference, mockery, or covert resistance, giving the emperor control over both political and social interactions. His deliberate exaggeration of gender roles made every appearance unpredictable and politically charged. The emperor also encouraged role reversals among his guests. Accounts suggest that men were sometimes dressed in women's clothing or compelled to participate in theatrical performances that inverted social hierarchies. Women of the court could be assigned positions of authority in ceremonial contexts, while traditional distinctions between patrician and servant were occasionally suspended. These exercises created a deliberately disorienting environment in which ordinary social codes were suspended, and obedience to imperial will became the measure of propriety. The emperor's pleasure in subverting expectations was intertwined with political calculation. Those who resisted were marginalized, while those who complied demonstrated flexibility, loyalty, and social intelligence, reinforcing the idea that social survival depended on participation in the spectacle. In addition to clothing, Elagabalus experimented with personal appearance and sexual presentation. Contemporary sources claim he used cosmetics, hair treatments, and scents traditionally associated with women, and he frequently paraded in public with companions selected for beauty or novelty rather than rank. These companions could include both men and women, creating ambiguity that flustered observers and reinforced the idea that the emperor's authority was absolute and unbounded by tradition. The blending of gender, performance, and status challenged Roman perceptions of power as inherently masculine, presenting a ruler whose identity and pleasure dictated courtly norms and social expectations. The social and political implications were immediate. Senators and courtiers could no longer rely on established rituals of masculinity or hierarchy to navigate court life. They were forced to respond to unpredictable spectacles and social experiments dictated by a 14-year-old emperor. This destabilization extended to alliances and patronage networks, as compliance with Elagabalus's performances often determined favor, access, and influence. The emperor's manipulation of appearance, attire, and ceremony became another layer in the elaborate system of control he exercised over Rome's elite, and observers quickly realized that defiance carried social consequences. Elagabalus's innovations were often presented as extensions of religious or cultural practice. Some historians argue that his adoption of feminine attire and public theatrics echoed Syrian rituals associated with the sun god Elagabal, where gender fluidity and performative devotion were not uncommon. By incorporating these elements into the Roman imperial court, he fused personal expression with religious symbolism, ensuring that defiance of convention was both spectacle and statement. Participation in these rituals became a marker of loyalty, while refusal could be interpreted as both political opposition and spiritual disrespect, with the added effect of publicly distinguishing the compliant from the resistant. By the end of 218 CE, cross-dressing and role reversals had become a defining feature of Elagabalus's reign. The emperor's manipulation of gender and social norms extended his authority beyond politics into culture and personal identity. Courtiers, senators, and citizens alike were drawn into a court where appearances, performance, and obedience dictated status, and where the young emperor's whims blurred the boundaries between tradition, spectacle, and absolute power. Under Elagabalus, the theater of the court became inseparable from the politics of control, leaving a lasting impression of audacity, unpredictability, and social disruption that would be remembered for generations. Sexual liberties and shocking indulgences. Elagabalus's reign was marked not only by spectacle and religious novelty, but also by an unrestrained approach to sexual expression that scandalized Rome. From the earliest months of 218 CE, the young emperor openly flouted conventions of sexual behavior, both in private and in public settings, using sexuality as an instrument of power, performance, and social disruption. Historical accounts emphasize his preference for partners of all genders, his orchestration of sexual games, and his willingness to challenge the rigid moral and social codes expected of Roman rulers, creating an atmosphere in which pleasure, politics, and provocation were inseparable, and where the boundaries of public decency were constantly tested. The emperor's personal relationships were a central feature of court life. Elagabalus is said to have formed intimate liaisons with men, women, and eunuchs, often publicly displaying favoritism, jealousy, or theatrical affection in ways that drew the attention, and sometimes the ire, of senators, soldiers, and common citizens alike. Some companions were chosen for beauty, novelty, or exotic origin rather than rank, emphasizing the emperor's ability to define intimacy and status on his own terms. Public acknowledgement of these relationships disrupted traditional expectations of imperial dignity, blurring the line between personal indulgence and political theater, and leaving Rome's elites unsure how to respond to the unpredictable emperor. Banquets and court gatherings frequently became stages for sexual display. Guests might be presented with elaborate entertainments that included dancers, actors, or performers engaged in eroticized tableaux, while others were encouraged or compelled to participate in games that inverted social hierarchies. Historical sources describe occasions in which men were dressed in women's attire and women assumed dominant roles in staged erotic interactions, reflecting the broader courtly preoccupation with role reversal, experimentation, and the subversion of societal norms. These spectacles were simultaneously titillating, humiliating, and politically instructive. Compliance demonstrated flexibility, loyalty, and the ability to navigate a court where erotic display was intertwined with power, influence, and the emperor's unpredictable whims. Elagabalus's sexual innovations also intersected with religious practice. Some historians suggest that rites associated with the Syrian sun god Elagabal incorporated elements of sensuality or bodily display, which the emperor adapted to Roman settings. Priests, attendants, and participants in these ceremonies might be arranged in choreographed patterns designed to blend ritual with spectacle, making sexual activity both devotional and demonstrative. In this context, the emperor's sexual liberties were framed not merely as personal indulgence, but as extensions of sacred authority, asserting his divine favor while destabilizing conventional hierarchies of morality, gender, and propriety. Sexuality became inseparable from ritual and performance, entwining devotion with domination. The political ramifications were significant. Senators and courtiers could be co-opted, manipulated, or embarrassed through these displays, leaving little room for dissent. Attendance at erotic games or participation in sexualized rituals became an implicit test of loyalty, while refusal could result in social exclusion, loss of favor, or even suspicion of disloyalty. In this way, Elagabalus used sexuality as both a personal indulgence and a method of governance, turning private desires into instruments of political control and reinforcing his unpredictable authority over Rome's elite. Public reaction was mixed, and contemporary historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian recorded both fascination and outrage. Many elite Romans were shocked by the young emperor's open defiance of moral norms, while others adapted pragmatically, participating in spectacles to secure favor or protection. For ordinary citizens, rumors of his sexual activities contributed to an image of a ruler whose unpredictability, excess, and audacity knew no bounds, reinforcing the perception that under Elagabalus, Roman authority and decorum had entered a realm of unprecedented personal and political experimentation, leaving no aspect of social expectation untouched. By the end of 218 CE, Elagabalus's sexual liberties and shocking indulgences were established as defining features of his court. They extended beyond private behavior into public spectacle, ritual, and political manipulation, leaving senators, courtiers, and citizens alike to navigate an environment where pleasure, performance, and power were inseparable. The young emperor's blending of eroticism with authority challenged conventions, destabilized social hierarchies, and ensured that the court of Elagabalus would be remembered as one of the most scandalous, provocative, and unprecedented in Roman history. A vivid demonstration of the ways in which desire could be wielded as a tool of control, influence, and spectacle. Exotic guests and foreign intrigue. Elagabalus's court was never limited to Roman citizens or local elites. From the earliest months of his reign in 218 CE, the young emperor cultivated an environment rich in exoticism, welcoming foreign nobles, gladiators, performers, and artisans, whose presence both fascinated and unsettled the city of Rome. This deliberate inclusion of outsiders reflected his desire to create a court that was otherworldly, theatrical, and, at times, politically subversive. By surrounding himself with individuals from distant lands, Elagabalus blurred the boundaries between the familiar and the foreign, ensuring that the imperial palace was as much a space of spectacle and curiosity as it was of governance, diplomacy, and social instruction. Visitors to the palace encountered a dizzying array of cultures, appearances, and behaviors. Nobles from Syria, Phoenicia, and North Africa were often treated as guests of honor, their distinctive dress, accents, and customs highlighting the cosmopolitan reach of the emperor's influence. Gladiators from the provinces, renowned for their skill and ferocity, performed not only in the arena but also during private entertainments, serving as living symbols of Roman martial power and exotic spectacle. Musicians, dancers, and acrobats from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and the Eastern Mediterranean added layers of auditory, visual, and kinetic stimulation, creating immersive experiences that heightened the sense of wonder and sometimes unease among Roman elites and visiting dignitaries alike. Elagabalus frequently orchestrated encounters that juxtaposed Roman senators with these foreign visitors, creating situations that disrupted traditional hierarchies and social expectations. Senators might find themselves seated beside an Eastern prince, a Nubian dancer, or a Persian musician, while courtiers were sometimes compelled to participate in games or performances alongside individuals whose customs were unfamiliar or disorienting. These arrangements were not random. They were carefully calculated to assert the emperor's control over courtly behavior and to destabilize traditional forms of authority, reminding elites that proximity to power required flexibility, attentiveness, and performative deference. The presence of foreigners also served practical political purposes. Alliances and loyalties could be cultivated through ceremonial honors, gifts, or public recognition, while rivals might be subtly humiliated by juxtaposition with exotic guests or performers. Elagabalus leveraged the novelty of these outsiders to reinforce his own image as a ruler whose authority transcended conventional Roman expectations, suggesting that imperial power was not bound by geography, custom, or tradition. By turning foreign guests into both entertainment and instruments of governance, the young emperor reinforced the intricate connections between spectacle, social manipulation, and political control. Some of the most dramatic spectacles involve stark displays of cultural contrast. Historical accounts describe banquets where Eastern princes performed ritual dances, acrobats executed feats of daring, and musicians introduced unfamiliar instruments, scales, and harmonies. Gladiators might be pitted against one another in private exhibitions, while exotic animals from Africa and Asia, including leopards, ostriches, and monkeys, were paraded through halls and gardens. The combination of sights, sounds, movement, and color created an environment in which Roman visitors were constantly reminded of the emperor's unpredictability and his mastery of blending politics with theatrical performance. Elagabalus also cultivated personal relationships with select foreigners, elevating them to positions of influence or public visibility that would have been impossible under previous emperors. These companions, chosen for skill, beauty, novelty, or exotic origin, served both as aids and instruments of imperial showmanship. Their presence reinforced the perception that loyalty and status at court were contingent not only on Roman rank, but on participation in the emperor's carefully staged spectacles. The young ruler's embrace of the exotic was thus both aesthetic and political, turning the palace into a living theater for demonstrating the reach, creativity, and audacity of imperial authority. By the end of 218 CE, the integration of foreign guests, performers, and outsiders had become a defining characteristic of Elagabalus's court. Rome was introduced to a palace alive with unfamiliar languages, appearances, scents, and customs, where every visit was an orchestrated mixture of entertainment, diplomacy, and social disruption. Through this deliberate cultivation of exoticism, the emperor extended his influence beyond Roman tradition, using the presence of foreigners to mesmerize, manipulate, and maintain authority over his subjects. The court was no longer merely a seat of government. It had become a theatrical arena in which culture, politics, and spectacle intertwined, leaving a lasting impression of audacity, unpredictability, and the extraordinary reach of imperial imagination. Political maneuvering behind the revels. Elagabalus's reign was not merely a succession of spectacles, banquets, and exotic entertainments. Behind every display lay careful political calculation. From the outset of his rule in 218 CE, the young emperor and his advisors, particularly his grandmother Julia Maesa and mother Julia Soaemias, recognized that the court's theatricality could serve as a tool for consolidating power. By controlling perception, manipulating alliances, and orchestrating social hierarchies, Elagabalus transformed revelry into governance, ensuring that loyalty, obedience, and influence were inseparable from participation in the imperial pageantry. The emperor's extravagances were strategically entwined with political observation. Banquets, religious ceremonies, and displays of exotic culture allowed him to evaluate the temperament, adaptability, and allegiance of senators, courtiers, and military officers. Attendance at lavish events became a test. Those who embraced the emperor's whims demonstrated flexibility, tact, and submission, while those who resisted or refused were immediately marked as potential adversaries. In this sense, the court's entertainment served dual purposes: pleasure for some, but surveillance and social sorting for all. Julia Maesa, the architect behind much of this manipulation, understood the precariousness of placing a 14-year-old on the throne. She maintained control through a combination of guidance, persuasion, and strategic intervention, ensuring that the emperor's public image appeared dazzling, yet unassailable. By positioning herself and Julia Soaemias as advisors and intermediaries, Maesa both protected her grandson from political missteps and reinforced the notion that authority flowed outward from the imperial family. Senators and military officers were acutely aware that approval from these women and compliance with their designs was essential for survival and advancement within the court. The use of foreign guests, performers, and exotic displays was equally political. Elagabalus deliberately juxtaposed Roman elites with outsiders whose customs, language, and appearance unsettled traditional hierarchies. Senators seated beside Eastern princes, courtiers participating in elaborate games, or attendants forced into unfamiliar roles were constantly reminded that power depended on adaptation and compliance. Such arrangements destabilized conventional authority, making it clear that rank alone did not guarantee influence. Every act of spectacle carried an implicit lesson. Imperial favor could be awarded or withdrawn based on the capacity to navigate the court's carefully curated environment. Religious rituals, particularly those involving the Syrian sun god Elagabalus, were also carefully politicized. By weaving devotion to the deity into public ceremonies and banquets, Elagabalus converted religious participation into a demonstration of loyalty to the throne. Priests, attendants, and even senators were expected to recognize the supremacy of Elagabalus, a symbolic acknowledgement that aligned spiritual and political authority. Resistance to these rituals was interpreted not only as impiety, but also as potential disloyalty, further consolidating the emperor's power through subtle coercion. Moreover, the young emperor leveraged personal relationships as political instruments. Intimate companions, favored courtiers, and even entertainers were elevated to positions of visibility or influence, signaling that proximity to the emperor and participation in his spectacles was as consequential as formal rank. Favoritism, jealousy, and rivalry were amplified through the deliberate orchestration of social dynamics, ensuring that political maneuvering was inseparable from the court's theatricality. The very acts of dining, observing rituals, or attending entertainment became exercises in alliance, subordination, and strategic calculation. Despite the youthful emperor's reputation for excess, these strategies proved effective in consolidating the sovereign hold on power. By combining indulgence with oversight, spectacle with surveillance, and religion with political obligation, Elagabalus created a court that operated as both theater and instrument of governance. Senators and courtiers quickly learned that compliance and performance were inseparable from political survival, and the emperor's caprices were simultaneously entertaining, intimidating, and instructive. By the end of 218 CE, the interplay between revelry and strategy had become a defining feature of Elagabalus's rule. The young emperor's court was a stage for political observation as much as it was for extravagant spectacle. Through manipulation, theatricality, and social engineering, Elagabalus and his family maintained authority, secured loyalty, and reinforced the notion that under his reign, power was a performance as well as a prerogative. The extraordinary interplay of indulgence, control, and strategy left a lasting impression. In Rome, to witness the emperor's excess was to recognize the subtle, unyielding force of imperial authority. The emperor as a performer. Elagabalus's reign was defined not only by extravagance, religious novelty, and social experimentation, but also by the deliberate theatricality of his own persona. From his arrival in Rome in 218 CE, the young emperor transformed himself into the central figure of courtly spectacle, blending performance, devotion, and authority into a single, overwhelming display. In this environment, Elagabalus was both ruler and performer, with the palace, banquets, religious ceremonies, and public appearances all serving as stages for his audacious assertion of power. He understood instinctively that in a city so attuned to spectacle, personal visibility was itself a tool of governance, and he exploited this with skill beyond his years. The emperor's personal comportment was central to this performative identity. Contemporary accounts describe him dressing in elaborate clothing, often combining Syrian, Roman, and exotic influences, adorning himself with jewelry, perfumes, and makeup. He moved through public spaces, banquets, and ceremonial processions with deliberate gestures, dramatic entrances, and carefully staged displays of authority and flamboyance. Each appearance reinforced his identity as a ruler unbound by convention, whose whims dictated both aesthetic and political norms. The spectacle of his presence ensured that attention was always focused on him, creating a sense that power was inseparable from visibility and performance. Even casual moments could be orchestrated to leave observers both impressed and unsettled. Performance extended beyond attire and appearance. Elagabalus staged interactions, orchestrated ceremonies, and choreographed banquets with the precision of a theatrical director. Senators, courtiers, and visiting dignitaries were often assigned roles in these performances, whether as participants in ritual, observers of dramatic spectacle, or unwitting actors in social games. By incorporating others into his displays, the emperor asserted control over both the physical space of the court and the social hierarchies within it, ensuring that every individual's status was measured in part by their response to his performance. The constant awareness of being observed created an atmosphere in which every gesture, word, or glance carried political weight. Religious ceremonies were a key aspect of this performative rule. The emperor's devotion to the Syrian sun god Elagabalus was never private. It was enacted as public spectacle. Processions, sacrifices, and rituals involving exotic objects, priests, and attendants were meticulously staged to impress, intimidate, and remind participants of the fusion of spiritual and temporal authority. Elagabalus himself often assumed the role of high priest, combining devotion with dramatic display, making every ritual simultaneously a performance of faith and a demonstration of personal power. The palace became a theater in which the divine and imperial converged, leaving observers both awed and unsettled. The boundaries between ceremony, devotion, and theater were deliberately blurred, reinforcing the emperor's omnipresence. Even private banquets were transformed into performative arenas. Elaborate decor, exotic animals, music, and choreography combined with culinary extravagance to create immersive experiences, where guests' reactions were observed and evaluated. Compliance, admiration, or discomfort became indicators of loyalty, insight, or vulnerability. The line between personal indulgence and political strategy was blurred. Attending a banquet was simultaneously a civic obligation, a social test, and a participation in imperial theater. Guests became actors in a play authored by the emperor, their responses contributing to the ongoing drama of court life. Elagabalus's theatricality also encompassed gender, sexuality, and social hierarchy. His cross-dressing, role reversals, and public sexual liberties were all forms of performance that challenged traditional Roman expectations. By experimenting with identity, intimacy, and authority, the emperor ensured that every interaction was potentially a stage, every act of compliance or resistance an element of drama. Political power was inseparable from spectacle, and personal expression was inseparable from public display. He demonstrated that authority could be asserted as much through artifice, allure, and audacity as through decree or military might. By the end of 218 CE, it was clear that Elagabalus had transformed the concept of imperial authority. His reign demonstrated that rulership could be performed, with visibility, drama, and orchestrated spectacle serving as instruments of power. The young emperor's ability to merge governance with theater reshaped the expectations of courtly life, leaving senators, courtiers, and citizens constantly aware that authority was as much about performance as decree. In Rome, under Elagabalus, the emperor was not only a ruler but a performer, whose every gesture, costume, and ceremony was a calculated demonstration of dominance, identity, and the extraordinary potential of spectacle in the exercise of power. The dangerous games. Elagabalus's reign was marked not only by religious spectacle, banquets, and theatrical display, but also by games that blurred the line between entertainment and peril. From early in 218 CE, the young emperor devised elaborate entertainments that tested the limits of courage, endurance, and obedience, transforming the palace and surrounding grounds into arenas of suspense, hazard, and dramatic tension. These games were not mere amusement. They were instruments of control, spectacle, and political signaling, ensuring that those who entered the emperor's presence remained constantly aware of both his whim and his power, as well as the ever-present possibility of humiliation or danger. The dangerous games ranged from physical contests to psychological trials. Gladiators and trained performers were frequently employed in displays designed to awe, intimidate, and unsettle. Some events involved duels staged before an audience of senators, courtiers, and foreign guests, where participants risked injury or death to please the emperor. Others involved the release of wild animals into enclosed spaces, creating chaos and fear for both human and beast. Guests were often positioned to witness, participate, or even intervene, forcing them to navigate a precarious balance between observation, action, and survival. The unpredictability of these spectacles reinforced the young emperor's dominance, as no one could anticipate the precise nature, scale, or severity of the next display. Elagabalus also orchestrated games that combined physical danger with theatrical performance. Courtyards, banquet halls, and gardens became stages for choreographed encounters, in which combat, ritual, and spectacle intersected. Senators and courtiers could find themselves unexpectedly involved, asked to judge contests, serve as assistants, or even participate in risky feats that tested nerves and composure. These arrangements disrupted traditional hierarchies and emphasized the emperor's control over both status and circumstance. Every participant, whether willing or coerced, was made aware that proximity to the emperor entailed risk, obligation, and constant observation. The integration of exotic elements heightened the intensity of the games. Animals from distant provinces, performers from across the empire, and elaborate props created spectacles that were visually striking and emotionally overwhelming. Lions, leopards, and other predatory animals were sometimes incorporated into performances, their unpredictability amplifying fear and fascination. Gladiators trained in foreign techniques displayed unfamiliar combat styles, while dancers and acrobats executed daring feats that combined artistry with danger. These elements ensured that even seasoned elites, accustomed to Rome's entertainments, were captivated, disoriented, and often unsettled by the combination of beauty, peril, and spectacle. Audiences were made to feel simultaneously privileged and vulnerable, reinforcing the emperor's omnipresent authority. Psychological games were equally central to the emperor's strategy. Elagabalus took delight in manipulating expectations, staging events where the outcome appeared uncertain, or where participants were forced to make rapid moral, social, or tactical choices. Senators might be presented with tasks that challenged courage, diplomacy, or loyalty. Courtiers could be placed in situations requiring both discretion and compliance. These trials tested not only physical skill, but also social intelligence, forcing individuals to demonstrate adaptability in a court environment where favor, reputation, and survival were closely intertwined. Religious elements were often interwoven into the dangerous games. Processions and rituals connected to the Syrian sun god Elagabalus were sometimes staged alongside or within these spectacles, blending devotion with danger. Priests, attendants, and ceremonial objects could play roles in games that combined ritual significance with risk, ensuring that participation was both an expression of loyalty and an acknowledgement of divine favor. In this way, Elagabalus reinforced the perception that the emperor's authority, spiritual sanction, and entertainment were inseparable. By the end of 218 CE, the dangerous games had become a hallmark of Elagabalus's court. They served multiple purposes: testing courage, reinforcing obedience, demonstrating wealth and power, and ensuring that all who entered the emperor's presence were acutely aware of the consequences of defiance, inattention, or hesitation. Through these spectacles, the young ruler transformed entertainment into a tool of control, making fear, awe, and participation inseparable from political life. The games were a vivid reflection of Elagabalus's ability to merge danger, drama, and governance, leaving a lasting impression on all who witnessed them and cementing his reputation as one of Rome's most audacious, unpredictable, and theatrically inventive emperors. Marriage, manipulation, and annulment. Elagabalus's approach to marriage reflected the same audacity, theatricality, and disregard for convention that characterized his entire reign. From early in 218 CE, the young emperor used matrimonial alliances not merely as personal choices, but as instruments of political strategy, spectacle, and manipulation. Traditional Roman expectations of marital decorum were repeatedly subverted, leaving senators, courtiers, and the public both scandalized and perplexed. Under Elagabalus, marriage became a stage upon which ambition, desire, and authority intersected, with each union serving as a demonstration of imperial power, personal caprice, and an assertion of dominance that few could question or resist. The emperor's first marriage, to Julia Cornelia Paula, was orchestrated as much for political optics as personal preference. Paula was chosen from a noble family to consolidate the emperor's standing with certain Roman elites. Yet the ceremony itself was lavish beyond precedent, filled with exotic decorations, elaborate rituals, and public displays designed to awe spectators. Contemporary accounts describe the marriage as a theatrical event in which the young emperor asserted both his dominance and his deliberate disregard for traditional social boundaries. Though Paula was formally elevated to empress, her role was largely symbolic. Her personal influence at court was minimal, and she existed primarily as an instrument of display, political alignment, and strategic diplomacy. Guests attending the nuptials were struck not only by the opulence of the event, but by the subtle signals of Elagabalus's control over both ceremony and society. The brevity of Elagabalus's first marriage exemplified his unpredictable approach to unions. Within months, the emperor pursued annulment, citing capricious or theatrical reasons, and replaced Paula with Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. This unprecedented choice sent shockwaves through Roman society, as Vestals were traditionally sworn to chastity for life, their vows symbolizing the spiritual integrity of Rome itself. By marrying Severa, Elagabalus directly challenged centuries of religious and social norms, demonstrating that imperial will could override even sacred tradition. The marriage was simultaneously scandalous and symbolic, merging religious daring with political audacity, and it further cemented the perception that Elagabalus's reign was defined by audacious acts that blurred private desire, public spectacle, and state authority. The decision created widespread commentary, provoking fear, admiration, and bewilderment among senators and citizens alike. Elagabalus's manipulation of marriage extended beyond religious shock value. By marrying individuals from different social, political, and religious backgrounds, he controlled alliances, provoked elites, and cultivated loyalty or fear through uncertainty. Annulments were as deliberate as weddings, signaling both displeasure and the emperor's absolute power to redefine relationships at will. Courtiers quickly learned that marital status under Elagabalus was never stable, and that proximity to the emperor could bring both privilege and vulnerability. The constant unpredictability ensured that no one at court could take their position for granted, reinforcing that personal relationships and social status were inseparable from the whims of imperial authority. In this way, marriage became another instrument in his complex system of control, intertwining personal whims with political calculation and blending social experimentation with overt demonstration of power. The emperor's marriages also served as performances of erotic and aesthetic spectacle. Ceremonies involved lavish decor, exotic flowers, perfumes, and dramatic processions, echoing the theatricality of banquets and court events. Guests were both participants and observers, compelled to witness and, in some cases, participate in these unions that publicly celebrated the emperor's power, taste, and disdain for convention. The interplay of sexuality, spectacle, and statecraft underscored a central truth of Elagabalus's reign. Loyalty, admiration, and obedience were inseparable from participation in his carefully orchestrated vision of authority. Every marriage was both a personal choice and a political act, a deliberate stage on which the young emperor could redefine societal expectations, enforce hierarchy, and display dominance. By the end of 218 CE, Elagabalus had transformed marriage into a tool for manipulation, display, and consolidation of both personal and political power. Annulments and controversial unions demonstrated that, under his rule, no social, religious, or moral boundary was immune to imperial whim. Senators, courtiers, and citizens alike were forced to navigate a world where matrimony was simultaneously personal, political, and performative, and where the emperor's desires dictated both law and spectacle. Elagabalus's marriages, annulments, and provocations left an indelible mark on Roman society, revealing a ruler unbound by convention, wielding intimacy as both a weapon and a stage, and redefining the possibilities of imperial authority. In combining personal desire with political strategy, ceremonial excess, and public shock, Elagabalus ensured that even the sacred institution of marriage became inseparable from spectacle, control, and the audacious assertion of power that defined his extraordinary, unpredictable reign. The palace guards and courtly chaos. Chaos paraded in gold, steel, and ritual within Elagabalus's palace. From the instant he arrived in Rome in 218 CE, the young emperor reshaped his palace guards into more than protectors. They became instruments of spectacle, intimidation, and political theater. Loyalty, fear, and performance fused into one, and anyone moving through the marble halls quickly discovered that proximity to power demanded vigilance, adaptability, and flawless obedience. Security was no longer a silent function of government. It was a staged performance, as deliberate and dazzling as any banquet or sacrifice. The Praetorian Guard, long the most elite defenders of Rome's emperors, were drawn into this strange pageant. No longer confined to gates or fortress walls, they patrolled ceremonial halls, shadowed banquets, and stood in courtyards like living statues of authority. Their presence reminded courtiers that every word, gesture, and glance could be watched and judged. Displays of loyalty, precision drills, and martial demonstrations were staged not merely for safety but for effect, calculated to instill awe, fear, and submission. For senators and envoys, Standing in the emperor's presence meant both privilege and peril. Elagabalus reshaped the composition of his attendants as well, adding exotic layers to his defenses. Foreign recruits, unusual warriors, and servants with rare skills filled the palace. Their costumes were embroidered, their movements theatrical, and their behavior often unpredictable, mirroring the emperor's taste for spectacle. To Roman nobles accustomed to sober military discipline, the guards' flamboyance was unsettling. Courtiers were forced to adapt instantly to an environment where ceremony merged with security, and where even the most ordinary encounter might double as a test of loyalty. The guards were never simply passive watchers. They were pressed into the emperor's endless theater of power. During banquets, religious rites, or staged entertainments, they arranged guests, controlled movement, and at times participated in the performance itself. The line between defender and actor blurred, transforming the palace into a vast stage where every participant, noble or soldier, was drawn into the drama. Their duty was not only to shield the emperor's body, but also to amplify his presence, embodying the aura of command Elagabalus demanded. Uncertainty became a weapon. The emperor delighted in engineering surprises that tested the composure of his court. He might order sudden displays of martial discipline, strange processions, or bursts of force staged without warning. Those who faltered, flinched, or failed to respond with the right mixture of awe and submission marked themselves as weak. No one ever felt secure. Survival required sharp instincts, flexibility, and a readiness to perform one's role with precision. This chaos extended beyond uniforms and drills. Elagabalus's fascination with the exotic and unconventional reshaped his household into something deliberately unsettling. Cross-dressing attendants mingled with foreign performers. Guards might appear in ceremonial robes rather than armor, or in roles that mocked traditional hierarchies, social norms, gender roles, military ranks. Even the solemnity of Roman ritual were continuously challenged. To succeed, a courtier needed to interpret these cues instantly, reading the emperor's shifting moods and the guards' symbolic gestures as though they were lines in a play. Even the smallest details mattered. A poorly timed bow, a hesitant answer, or a glance of disapproval could carry consequences. Guards, positioned not only as protectors but also as observers, relayed the moods of courtiers to the emperor, ensuring that every movement was noted. Thus, the palace became a labyrinth of performance, where nothing was accidental and everything might be interpreted as loyalty or betrayal. By the close of 218 CE, the guards had become more than soldiers. They were symbols of imperial audacity, instruments of manipulation, and embodiments of theatrical control. Their presence reshaped the meaning of power in the palace, reminding all who entered that in Elagabalus's Rome, protection itself had become theater. The emperor orchestrated space, personnel, and ritual until the palace resembled less a fortress than a living stage. Guards were shields and actors at once, enforcing obedience through both vigilance and spectacle. The lesson was unmistakable. In the reign of Elagabalus, power was never static. It was performed, dramatized, and woven into the daily fabric of palace life. The palace guards embodied this truth, making every corner of Rome's court a living drama in which loyalty was tested, fear cultivated, and authority displayed in forms both dazzling and unnerving. Those who entered left, knowing that under Elagabalus, even defense wore a mask, and that chaos itself had found a uniform. Rome's outrage. Rome had endured strange emperors before. Caligula's madness, Nero's theatrical excess, and Domitian's tyranny had tested the patience of the city, but Elagabalus presented something altogether different. His reign was not only eccentric but foreign, audacious, and deliberately provocative, a challenge to the very foundations of Roman identity. Outrage did not erupt overnight. It simmered, built through whispers in the forum, discontent in the Senate, and mutterings among the legions, until it coalesced into a storm of resentment that threatened to undo him. Religion lay at the center of Rome's fury. The city defined itself through its gods, temples, and rituals, each bound to its destiny as caput mundi, the head of the world. Elagabalus disrupted this order with breathtaking audacity. He elevated his Syrian deity, Elagabal, above Jupiter and Mars, dragging sacred Roman relics into the service of his foreign cult. The eternal fire of Vesta, symbol of Rome's survival, was forced into his new rituals. Senators and priests were compelled to attend processions that paraded through the streets with drums, dancers, and outlandish sacrifices. To pious Romans, these rites were not religion but desecration. They saw not devotion, but an emperor spitting on the very gods who had carried Rome to glory. Marriage became another flashpoint. When Elagabalus wed Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, outrage spread like wildfire. Vestals embodied Rome's chastity, purity, and divine protection. For one to marry was unthinkable. For the emperor himself to break her vows was nothing less than sacrilege. Many feared divine retribution, convinced that the city's safety had been placed in peril. Even annulments and remarrying did little to calm tempers. Each new ceremony was more lavish, more provocative, and more insulting to Roman sensibilities. Marriage, once sacred and stabilizing, had become in Elagabalus's hands a stage for scandal. The Senate, proud of its ancient dignity, was not spared humiliation. Elagabalus treated senators less as advisors and guardians of tradition than as unwilling extras in his endless theater. They were forced to watch grotesque banquets, to sit beside foreign performers and cross-dressing attendants, and to applaud when the emperor flaunted his blasphemous god. Authority was mocked, their gravitas stripped away. Rome's political elite, already weary of youthful emperors, now felt their very identity under siege. The people of Rome, at first dazzled by spectacles, soon shifted from awe to discontent. Exotic animals paraded through the streets, banquets overflowed with food, and games entertained the masses, but all of it carried the taint of the foreign, the theatrical, the un-Roman. Processions honoring a Syrian sun god felt alien, not celebratory. Rumors of the emperor's indulgences, his cross-dressing, his lovers, his brazen disregard for customs spread in taverns and markets. What once amused, now unsettled. For the plebeians, who relied on stability as much as bread, this foreign emperor seemed to place Rome's fate at risk for the sake of his whims. Even the legions grew wary. Soldiers, pragmatic and traditional, valued discipline and respect for Roman customs. The emperor's reliance on exotic guards, his parade of foreign attendants, and his scandalous personal behavior alienated men who saw themselves as guardians of the empire's legacy. While they tolerated his rule out of duty, whispers of discontent passed through the ranks, dangerous murmurs in an empire where military loyalty defined survival. Julia Maesa, the emperor's grandmother and one of his earliest champions, began to sense the shift in public mood. She had orchestrated his rise to power, but now she saw the very foundations of support eroding beneath him. Outrage among senators, unease among the populace, and restlessness in the army formed a dangerous trifecta. Her influence kept rebellion at bay, but even her presence could not silence the mounting voices of opposition. By 219 CE, outrage had hardened into a defining feature of Elagabalus's reign. He had not merely offended Roman sensibilities, he had defied them. Tradition, religion, and identity, the very pillars of Rome, were turned upside down in the name of spectacle and personal desire. To his supporters, he was bold and divinely inspired. To his detractors, he was reckless, sacrilegious, and unfit to rule. Rome's outrage was more than gossip or complaint. It was a warning, a signal that the emperor's audacity had crossed a line. No matter how dazzling his displays, how overwhelming his processions, or how intoxicating his banquets, Rome itself was beginning to turn against him. The city that had once cheered his arrival now whispered of his downfall. And in those whispers, the seeds of betrayal and tragedy were already taking root. Conspiracies and betrayals. The outrage that gripped Rome did not remain a murmur for long. In the shadows of temples, in whispered conversations at banquets, and in the guarded chambers of senators, discontent hardened into conspiracy. Elagabalus's reign had become a theater of provocation, and though some marveled at his audacity, far more feared that Rome itself might collapse under the weight of his sacrilege. When outrage reached the Senate, the army, and even the imperial household, betrayal became not a possibility, but an inevitability. The Senate, long stripped of real power, yet still clinging to its ancient dignity, was the first to breathe treason in private. Senators who had endured insults from Domitian and absurdities from Nero now found themselves dragged through ceremonies for a Syrian god. Their patience broke when Elagabalus ignored their counsel altogether, treating them less as statesmen than as stage props. In dimly lit porticos, they debated survival. To oppose an emperor outright was treason, yet silence meant complicity in blasphemy. A middle path emerged: wait for the army to act, then move swiftly to embrace the victor. The legions, however, were harder to gauge. Soldiers respected strength, discipline, and Roman tradition. Elagabalus offered none of these. His reliance on exotic guards, his parades of eunuchs and foreign attendants, and his rumored indulgences eroded trust. At first, they endured him for the sake of stability. But the army was no passive audience. It held the true power of the empire. And when commanders began to mutter that the emperor was unworthy, daggers of betrayal were already being sharpened. Julia Maesa, the emperor's grandmother, became the axis around which conspiracy turned. Cunning and pragmatic, she had engineered Elagabalus's rise. Yet she recognized the danger of clinging to him as his unpopularity deepened. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's kingmakers, grumbled under his leadership, and Maesa knew their loyalty could be bought or lost. To preserve her family's influence, she began to shift her favor toward her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, whose youth and restraint made him a palatable alternative to the Senate and army alike. In Maesa's quiet maneuvering, betrayal began to take flesh. Plots multiplied like shadows at dusk. Some envisioned assassination, a swift dagger ending the chaos. Others dreamed of exile, stripping Elagabalus of the purple and sending him back to Syria. Still others whispered of civil war, though none wished to see Rome bled again by rival emperors. The most practical minds realized that any plan required the cooperation of the Praetorian Guard. These soldiers, stationed within the very palace walls, were both the emperor's shield and the blade that could cut him down. Elagabalus sensed treachery, but his response only deepened the alienation. He staged ever stranger ceremonies, demanded ever greater displays of loyalty, and lashed out at those he suspected of plotting against him. Executions were rare. His cruelty was theatrical rather than systematic. But the fear of arbitrary humiliation drove many to consider betrayal the safer course. The emperor's unpredictability, once a tool of power, became a liability. Those who had once applauded now waited, silent, for a chance to see him fall. Betrayal seeped even into the emperor's closest circles. Courtiers who once paraded in his ceremonies began quietly offering their allegiance to Maesa and Alexander. Officers of the Praetorian Guard, outwardly loyal, entertained secret audiences with senators and commanders, gauging what rewards might follow if they abandoned the emperor. Each day, the palace grew less secure, its gilded halls echoing not with applause but with the quiet plotting of men and women who had tired of spectacle. By 220 CE, the balance had shifted. Rome no longer saw Elagabalus as merely eccentric. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and sacrilegious. Conspiracies hardened into plans, and plans into alliances. The Senate waited for the army. The army listened for Maesa. Maesa prepared her grandson, and within the Praetorian Guard, the line between loyalty and treachery thinned with every passing day. In the end, betrayal was not a question of if, but when. The stage was set, the actors prepared, and the empire held its breath. Elagabalus, still draped in silks and surrounded by his performers, believed himself untouchable. But behind the curtains of his theater, Rome itself conspired. The emperor had turned power into spectacle, but conspiracies, unlike ceremonies, were not performed for show. They were sharpened in silence, and their final act would end not in applause, but in blood. The fall begins. The decline of Elagabalus's reign did not arrive in a thunderclap. It began as a whisper, a shifting of loyalties, a hollowing of support within the palace itself. By 221 CE, Rome no longer trembled at his spectacles. It wearied of them. The emperor, once a figure of fascination and scandal, had become a liability to those who had cheered him into power. The grand theater he built around himself was beginning to collapse, and the stagehands were preparing for the final act. The first cracks appeared in the army. Soldiers had endured his eccentricities with the patience of men sworn to stability, but their tolerance frayed. Parades of eunuchs, guards in embroidered silks, and rituals that mocked Roman traditions left them uneasy. Where once they saluted with precision, now they murmured in the barracks. For a legionary, loyalty was measured in victories, discipline, and shared values. Elagabalus offered none. His failure in campaigns, his disregard for Roman gods, and his obsession with exotic rites convinced many he was unfit to rule. The Senate, cautious as ever, read the mood of the legions. Senators who once endured humiliation in silence now whispered of removal. They did not move openly. Rome had seen the fate of failed conspirators, but they positioned themselves for the moment when change became unavoidable. Their survival, they judged, lay not with Elagabalus, but with his younger cousin, Severus Alexander. Julia Maesa orchestrated this transition with ruthless foresight. The grandmother who had raised Elagabalus to power recognized that her creation could not last. She presented Alexander not merely as a relative, but as a corrective. A youth of Roman discipline, modest character, and stability. In private audiences with senators, commanders, and praetorian officers, she painted a stark choice: cling to chaos with Elagabalus, or embrace calm with Alexander. Her plotting gave shape to the empire's discontent. The Praetorian Guard, as always, held the deciding power. They had played their part in Elagabalus's theater, parading through ceremonies and enforcing his will with steel and spectacle. Yet they sensed his vulnerability. They felt the shifting winds in the streets of Rome, where disgust spread faster than incense smoke. The Praetorians were no strangers to betrayal. Emperors were made and unmade by their swords. And as Maesa courted their loyalty, Elagabalus's grip weakened. The emperor himself seemed dimly aware of how precarious his rule had become. Rather than moderating his excesses, he doubled down. He demanded greater honors for his Syrian god, staged stranger rituals, and forced courtiers to perform with absolute devotion. For those already inclined to betray him, his behavior confirmed their decision. For those still wavering, it became intolerable. Each new display eroded confidence, turning allies into enemies and neutral observers into conspirators. Whispers soon gave way to action. The Praetorians began holding secret councils, weighing their options. Officers spoke of Severus Alexander as though he were already emperor, testing reactions. Senators quietly pledged support should a change occur. Even within the palace, servants shifted allegiance, carrying gossip to Maesa's circle. Elagabalus still commanded the throne, but it was hollow, its pillars eaten away by treachery. Tension thickened in Rome. The people who had once gasped at his shocking parades now mocked them. Murmurs spread in marketplaces that the gods were angered by his reign, that famine and unrest were signs of divine displeasure. The mob, volatile and decisive, turned against him. An emperor without the love of the people, the trust of the army, or the respect of the Senate, was already falling, even if the crown still rested on his head. By the winter of 221, Elagabalus's palace no longer felt like a fortress. It was a gilded prison, watched by guards whose loyalty was already sold, filled with attendants who plotted in silence, and presided over by a grandmother whose ambitions had shifted to another. The emperor, wrapped in silks and rituals, still played his part as though the performance would never end. Yet the audience had turned. The Senate, the legions, the Praetorians, and even the Roman crowd awaited the final cue. The fall of Elagabalus did not begin with a sword, a vote, or a riot. It began with silence. Soldiers no longer cheering, senators no longer flattering, guards no longer watching with devotion. That silence was louder than any denunciation. It was the sound of an emperor abandoned, a ruler left alone upon his stage. And in Rome, no emperor survived such silence for long. Assassination and aftermath. The final act came swiftly, though its shadow had long been gathering. By March 222 CE, Rome no longer belonged to Elagabalus. The emperor still held the trappings of power, but his audience had deserted him, and the stage was prepared for his fall. The Praetorian Guard, guardians turned executioners, made their choice. The empire demanded stability, and they would provide it through blood. The drama began within the palace walls. Whispers of plots reached Elagabalus, and in desperation, he tried to bind the Praetorians to him with bribes, honors, and frantic promises. He paraded Severus Alexander before them, demanding the young cousin swear absolute loyalty. Yet the guards had already judged the play finished. They had no faith in his rituals, no fear of his god, no respect for his throne. In their eyes, Alexander was the future, and Elagabalus the past. When word spread that the Praetorians had gathered in secret council, Elagabalus panicked. He rushed to the camp, dragging Alexander with him, thinking to confront the mutiny in person. The soldiers greeted Alexander with cheers, and Elagabalus with silence. the meaning was unmistakable. No emperor survived silence. Realizing his danger, Elagabalus attempted retreat. He fled back toward the palace, clutching at his cousin, desperate to assert control. But the Praetorians pursued him. Panic replaced ceremony. Fear replaced ritual. The emperor, who had once staged spectacles with choreographed precision, now stumbled through his own final performance, the script torn from his hands. In the palace sanctuary, Elagabalus tried to hide some, say in a chest, others in a storeroom, while his mother begged for his life. The Praetorians showed no mercy. They dragged him out, stripped away his silks, and cut him down with the cold efficiency of men accustomed to deciding Rome's fate. His mother died beside him, loyal to the end, though powerless to shield her son from the empire's judgment. The corpse of the emperor, once adorned with jewels and worshipped as a living god, was treated with contempt. Soldiers mocked him, hauling his body through the streets as though it were an enemy's spoil. He was dragged, beaten, and mutilated before the jeering Roman mob who had grown to despise him. The people, once captivated by his shocking displays, now exulted in his humiliation. The final insult came at the Tiber. After being paraded through the city, his remains were thrown into the river, denied the dignity of a proper burial. For a Roman emperor whose predecessors had been enshrined, deified, or laid to rest with solemn grandeur, this ending was the ultimate disgrace. The man who had made himself a god was reduced to refuse, cast away as though Rome itself wished to wash its hands of him. In the aftermath, Severus Alexander was proclaimed emperor, a boy presented as the empire's salvation. Julia Maesa, ever the architect, secured her family's power once more, this time in a form Rome could accept. Alexander's youth promised malleability, his character promised moderation, and his reign was welcomed as a return to stability. Senators breathed easier. The Praetorians congratulated themselves, and the people rejoiced at the removal of the false priest who had shamed their city. Yet the echoes of Elagabalus did not vanish entirely. His brief reign had exposed the volatility of imperial power, the fragility of loyalty, and the ruthlessness of Rome's guardians. He had dared to upend traditions, mock hierarchies, and blur the lines of gender, religion, and authority. Though his end was bloody and humiliating, his defiance left a shadow, a reminder that the empire could be both dazzled and horrified by its rulers. For the court, the lesson was unmistakable. The emperor's crown was never secured by divine right, spectacle, or heritage alone. It rested on the shifting balances of the Senate, the legions, the people, and above all, the Praetorian Guard. To lose any one of these was dangerous. To lose them all was fatal. Elagabalus's reign ended not with a grand final ritual, but with the silence of abandoned loyalty, the steel of his own guards, and the laughter of a city that had turned against him. In his death, Rome washed away his experiment. But the memory of his audacity remained a cautionary tale of an emperor who mistook spectacle for strength, and who learned too late that in Rome, power was a performance only as long as the audience remained. Legacy of scandal. The death of Elagabalus did not erase him from Rome's memory. If anything, it secured his place as one of the most notorious emperors in history. His reign, brief yet turbulent, became a cautionary tale whispered in the Senate, repeated by historians, and embroidered by gossip until it blurred the line between truth and invention. What survived was not only the record of a young ruler, but the legend of a scandal that Rome never forgot. For many Romans, the emperor's greatest crime was not cruelty. Others had been far more ruthless, nor even incompetence, for weak rulers were nothing new. His unforgivable sin was audacity. He mocked traditions that anchored Roman identity, replacing them with foreign gods, alien rituals, and theatrical inversions of social norms. In a city that defined itself by order, hierarchy, and the weight of ancestral customs, Elagabalus had embodied disorder. He was remembered less as a statesman than as a disturber of boundaries. Between sacred and profane, male and female, Rome and the foreign, emperor and performer, ancient writers delighted in shaping his memory. Cassius Dio Herodian and the Historia Augusta painted him as a monster of indulgence, a youth consumed by lust, cruelty, and absurdity. They lingered on his banquets, his costumes, his marriages, his humiliations, tales of dancers, painted attendants, and scandalous unions that blurred propriety. These stories were not preserved to record daily reality, but to demonstrate what Rome rejected, To the senatorial elite, Elagabalus was not simply a failed emperor, but a warning. He stood as proof of what happened when tradition was defied, when spectacle triumphed over order, and when the empire's ruler forgot that his first duty was stability. Yet fragments of truth glimmer beneath the exaggeration. Elagabalus did attempt to impose the cult of Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, at the very heart of Roman religion. He did surround himself with attendants who violated expectations of gender and class, elevating eunuchs, actors, and foreigners to positions of intimacy. He did demand that power be expressed, not through discipline or conquest, but through spectacle and ritual. These choices, shocking to his contemporaries, made him unlike any emperor before or after. He sought to remake Rome in his own image, rather than allow himself to be shaped by its traditions. And for this, Rome branded him a heretic of identity. The scandal of his reign reshaped the imperial system itself. His fall reinforced the Senate's caution, the legion's vigilance, and the praetorians' decisive role in succession. Julia Maessa's political maneuvers, elevating first Elagabalus and then Severus Alexander, revealed the immense, if often unacknowledged, influence of women in Roman power structures. Elagabalus's failure became Alexander's justification. Where the former had been chaotic, the latter was orderly. Where one flaunted excess, the other embodied modesty. In this way, Elagabalus continued to shape Rome even in disgrace, for he set the boundaries of what emperors must not be. Over centuries, his legacy acquired new meanings. To moralists, he embodied decadence, the natural decay of empires when rulers abandoned discipline. To Christians, writing later, he became a symbol of pagan depravity, proof that Rome's traditional gods were corrupt and doomed. To others, especially in modern times, he appears not merely as a tyrant but as a figure who unsettled categories of gender, sexuality, and power in ways that still resonate. Historians, artists, and novelists alike return to him as an emblem of transgression, a youth who dared to blur boundaries that his world demanded remain fixed. Even his death could not cleanse the stain. Rome cast his body into the Tiber as if to wash away the shame, yet the attempt failed. His shadow remained, haunting the chronicles, shaping the memory of his dynasty, and provoking debate about what truly destroyed emperors. Was it indulgence, or was it the fear of elites confronted with a ruler too alien, too foreign, too bold? In the end, Elagabalus's legacy was scandal itself. His reign was remembered not for laws or victories, but for the audacity of spectacle. He showed Rome that power could be performed, that the emperor's body and rituals could be made into theater, and that such theater could terrify more than armies ever did. The empire buried him in disgrace, but history ensured that his story would endure. His reign, like a performance that refuses to end, continues to provoke, to shock, and to remind us that the line between authority and performance is fragile, and that in Rome, the memory of scandal often outlived the empire itself.